Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be the first one to speak in Richard's honor today. But I have to say, I'm afraid it doesn't have much to do with English literature. It's much more about Latin literature, but I hope you'll find it interesting. This presentation has been inspired by some remarkable figures in the panels of the so-called miracle windows, early Gothic stained glass at Canterbury Cathedral that picture the miracles of Thomas Becket. Glazed in the early 13th century, these windows retell stories drawn from two miracle collections written at Canterbury some 30 years earlier, in the 1170s, the decade following Becket's brutal murder. They are located in the walls of the ambulatory of the Trinity Chapel, and so here's Canterbury Cathedral. I've marked there in red for you where the windows are. And the next slide is an interior shot of the interior of that chapel. The candle here is where Thomas Becket's shrine stood from 1220 to the Reformation, and three of the miracle windows are visible here. Now you can get a sense of the scale and easy visibility of those windows from this slide here with a familiar figure. So you can just compare the size of my head there to the size of the windows to see how easy they really are to see. Now, in my recent work on the miracle windows, I've noticed that the glass narratives often picture people who are not discussed at all in the written collections. And the first panel I'd like to discuss is actually this one right by my head here. It's the first in a set of two telling the story of the healing of Etheldreda of Canterbury. Etheldreda's story is found in Benedict of Peterborough's collection of Becket miracles, and this is printed on your handout, both the Latin and my English translation, and I'll read one translation. A quartan fever had oppressed a certain Etheldreda, who lived in Canterbury but had been born elsewhere for nearly a year. Her bluish color and wax-like appearance indicated that she was near death. Coming, therefore, to the custodian monk of the tomb, she asked that she might drink the blood of the martyr. The monk mixed it with water, as it was customarily done for the rest, lest the taste or the color of blood induce horror in the drinker. Having drained what was in the cup, the woman's usual color returned, and her former vigor was restored. Afterwards, she was neither touched nor saddened by fevers, nor troubled by any vexation. Let's look now at the panel that retells this story. Again, this would have been glazed about 30 or 40 years after Benedict wrote his account of Etheldreda's miracle. Now you can see that it pictures the scene at Becket's tomb. This is the tomb here, this low marble structure with two openings. On the left, we see Etheldreda, hunched over from illness and holding her hands out in supplication, with a woman standing behind her. On the far right, we've got the monk custodian, who is holding a bowl and stirring away. And then standing in between Etheldreda and the monk is a man in a vivid green tunic and yellow cloak. He holds up a flask, looks back at the monk, and gestures towards Etheldreda. In her Corpus Vitriarum Catalogue of the Canterbury Glass, Madeline Cavendish describes this man simply as an attendant. This same attendant appears in the second panel illustrating Etheldreda's story. On the right side of the panel, Etheldreda now drinks from the bowl held by the monk, while on the left, the attendant in the same clothing in the same colors of clothing as on the first panel, holds up a hand in declamation. I will argue today that the glaziers who made this panel, and others like it, as you'll shortly see, were not simply trying to fill up empty space. They would have seen people like this at saint shrines, and not only at Canterbury. Most studies of pilgrimage and hagiography in the long 12th century, and including here, I have to admit, my own, envision the interaction of just two categories of people at shrines, the two explicitly mentioned in Benedict's account of Etheldreda's story: the monk custodians, the religious men in permanent residence who controlled the relics and sometimes wrote hagiography, and the lay pilgrims visiting the shrines, a much bigger and more varied group of people, but a group that was highly transient. The miracle window suggests that we need to envision a third category, a lay population that was non-transient. Laymen and occasionally minor clerics, and some women too, who would have been regulars at the shrines, either as servants or as more informal helpers, or as hangers-on, people who had been touched by the saint's power and never went home. Once I was on the lookout for such servants and regulars at the tomb, I began to find quite a few references to them in high medieval miracle collections. And in this presentation, I will strive to marry those textual references with what we see in the miracle windows. At the end of the paper, I will argue that we need to read these lay regulars as key players, quite likely the key players, in shaping the electric oral culture surrounding shrines. So let's start by looking more closely at this first Etheldraker panel and what the servant is doing, in particular what he is holding. Now, the pitfall in any study of medieval stained glass is the question of later restoration. But in the opinion of Madeleine Kavanagh's, this flask is made up of original medieval glass, and I believe it is meant to represent a flask containing Becket's blood. There are two other panels in the miracle windows with similarly shaped flasks. In this one, a glass flask is being held up by a doctor over a leprous monk, evidently for urine inspection. Now, if we compare these flasks, the servant's is clearly decorated and is likely to indicate a metallic container compared to this glass one. In another panel, we see a servant with a very similar container, this time actually in the act of pouring its liquid into a bowl. Now, these two flasks are not identical that the servants are holding, but they are close enough, I think, to identify them as the same thing, containers of Becket's blood. When we look at this image then, we are seeing a servant handling and entrusted with a precious cultic object. And now to some textual evidence. Herbert of Bosham, one of Becket's hagiographers, wrote a letter in the early 1170s to an abbot warning him about a bad former servant of the Church of Canterbury who was traveling around France and claiming that he had a large portion of Becket's blood, perhaps in a flask, who knows, which he was selling off, and that he also had the cap that Becket was wearing when he died. Benedict of Peterborough included a story in his collection about the baker of Canterbury, a servant named Godfred, who used a cloth soaked in Becket's blood to cure 3 of his sons. Benedict mentions Canterbury servants in just 2 other stories in his collection. In one, a monk orders a servant to relight a candle that had gone out on Becket's tomb. And in the other, the monks rejoice to find that one of their servants, who was always demanding more money, was forced by an illness and a forbidding vision to give money to the saint. And they all chuckled over this. Now, as you can tell from these references, monastic servants tend to appear in narrative sources in one of 3 ways: in excoriating terms, as with the bad servants selling off relics and demanding money; as helpers who appear fleetingly, relighting candles, guarding entrances, looking after pilgrims, and so on; and as recipients and subjects of miracles themselves. Benedict never writes specifically of servants helping to distribute Becket's relics to pilgrims, as we see on this panel, but there seems little reason to doubt that this is a historically accurate image. Let's look now at another intriguing panel. This is the second panel telling the story of the healing of a certain Juliana, who became ill after childbirth. Her nurse suggested that she should promise a candle to Becket, which she did, and after a short sleep, she woke up healed. And on this panel, you can see Juliana down here offering a coiled wick for a candle at the tomb. What is nowhere mentioned in the story is what's happening above Juliana's head. Now, restorations make it difficult to know if this figure actually was a monk. All of this is restored here. But what is certainly medieval glass is this part of the panel right there. That's all medieval glass. A man, or possibly a boy, given his smaller stature, is being handed something. The Corpus Vitriarum catalog describes the scene this way. Behind Juliana is a man with a box or a book, which he holds out towards a second man standing behind the tomb. If we look even closer, I think this object must be read as a book, not a box. You can even see the decorated binding here, and then a strap holding the book closed. Now, books appear in other panels resting on lecterns in the miracle windows quite frequently, actually, and you can see one here on this slide. Now, a book is not mentioned in Juliana's story, nor is it mentioned in the inscription to this panel. And I should say here that most of the miracle windows have inscriptions in Latin, and I've printed this one on your handout. The inscription to this panel reads, the translation, "She wakes, makes an offering, all pain departs." Again, nothing at all about a book or a handover. So, if you have ideas, I'd actually love to hear them about what's going on here. My guess is that this scene is meant to represent the writing of the story of Juliana's miracle, or perhaps the recording of a formal gift to the shrine. Is the figure in the red tunic meant to represent a lower servant, a boy perhaps, who is to put the book back in its place, or possibly a notary? I don't know. R.B. Dobson found evidence for what he termed a multitude of boys, providing a chaotic supply of unskilled labor at Durham Cathedral in the 15th century. And there's also intriguing evidence in the 12th century miracle collection for St. Erkenwald in London that boys were put to work at shrines. In one story, thieves break into the crypt to try to steal Erkenwald's body, but, and I quote, "The noise they were making awoke a youth, just barely out of boyhood, who habitually spent the night alone in the church and who had the job, along with two boys from the cathedral school, of guarding the place. His shouting and yelling so frightened the crowd of thieves that at the sound of the mighty little fellow's voice they ran off. Although the custodians of the upper church added their own shouts to this uproar, they were unable to catch the thieves." The division in the story between the work of the boys and the custodians of the upper church suggests a hierarchy of servants at work at shrines, as do other sources. At Canterbury, the sacrist, the monastic obedientiary who is in charge of the church and its contents, employed no less than 51 different servants in the mid-13th century when we first have evidence about the number and types of servants. In her study of the monastery of Westminster, Barbara Harvey found that the sacrist employed the most servants of any obedientiary, and these servants included a shrine keeper's servant, 4 churches of the church, and their servant. So clearly these servants of the sacrist had servants as well. At Ely, a 14th century statute decrees that two trustworthy servants of the sacrist were to watch the cathedral day and night, while at Lincoln, a night watchman, someone called a lay sacrist, and a candle lighter ate in sight of the shrine and slept there by night. In the early 15th century, 2 lay clerks were employed by the keepers of Becket's shrine, as we know from a detailed customary that survives from this time. And these lay clerks were never to leave the shrine unless the shrine keepers knew and consented to their absence. Now, these sources give the impression not just that there would have been more servants than monks present at any given time at shrines, but that often, especially at night or when the monks had business to attend to, they would have worked there alone. A number of stories about lay custodians in miracle collections portray them as working solo and taking matters into their own hands. One of these is found in the Miracles of St. Margaret of Stalin, in a story in which an insane woman, quote, entered the abbot's court and was so quick that no one could catch her before she had entered the church, without the knowledge of its custodians. When they saw her without any covering on her body, they were astonished and tried to expel her from the church. She fell to the ground, and the custodians, having compassion on her misery, carried her to the well of the blessed Queen Margaret. Although she seemed half dead, nevertheless they tied her hands and feet with fetters, and then left her covered with a linen cloth. Now, it seems rather a shame that this story was never illustrated in stained glass. But looking at other panels in the miracle windows, one can find images of servants looking after pilgrims, as in this panel. Now, this panel has been heavily restored, and its subject is not clear. But the man handing over the bowl there, and the man washing the person's leg there, are both made up of original medieval stained glass. And I've put this detail of the man washing the leg on your handout. I think it's an especially evocative image of a servant at work, and points to the close contact between servants and pilgrims that must have been common at shrines. It's possible that people doing the most menial tasks at the shrines, such as cleaning and mopping up, which must have been a necessity when there are so many sick people around, were not formally employed by the monks. A number of miracle collectors told stories about lay people who had been living off the alms of monks, in some cases for years, who then experienced miracles at shrines. The collector of the miracles of Swithin at Winchester, for instance, tells of how a poor deaf boy was, quote, received into the poorhouse by the almoner and lived for a long time in the house and courtyard of the monks before being healed. Geoffrey of Burton describes how, quote, there was a poor little woman who was supported in the monastery from the monks' charity, who spent a lot of time in the church and frequently prayed there overnight, beseeching the Holy Virgin Modwena to obtain the healing she had so long desired. More generally, Barbara Harvey writes of how people termed the poor of the almonry appear in monastic records from the mid-12th century on. These are people who lived in, as she puts it, and at Westminster, some of these resident poor were termed lay brethren by the mid-13th century. Harvey writes that they lived in the almonry and performed the lowliest of domestic chores in the monastery. So in addition to the servants formally employed by the monastery then, we should also envision lay people supported by the monks' alms who could well be loitering about and helping out at shrines. And this might have been quite a large group of people. At Canterbury, Archbishop Richard granted the Christchurch monks 2 churches in 1174 as income to support the poor of their almonry, and in 1177 he made yet another grant because the first was not sufficient. Of all the resident lay people at the shrines mentioned in the miracle collections, though, perhaps the most interesting group are those who had experienced miracles and then stayed on. There is a story in William of Canterbury's collection of the miracles of Becket, for instance, of a man cured of epilepsy who had, quote, kept close to, and the Latin here is adheribat, which could mean clung to, the tomb of the martyr for 2 years, because he feared his epilepsy would return if he went home again. Now, William does not say how this man supported himself, but at least some of these hangers-on were given employment or alms. Elward of Weststoning, a petty thief who was blinded and castrated and later very famously healed by Thomas Becket, came to Canterbury and, in William's words, quote, stayed many days with us, having a stipend from the wealth, the substantia, of the martyr. This seems to mean that the monks gave him money from offerings made at Becket's tomb. In another case, the collector of the miracles of the hand of St. James describes how a certain Gilbert, a keeper of hounds, found himself blind, and after going to many shrines was healed at Reading. Quote, rejoicing then in the love and honor of the apostle, he served many years in the guest house at Reading. At the conclusion of the story of the healing of a crippled boy at St. Bartholomew's Priory in London, the miracle collector notes that the boy served the canons of the church in their kitchen, and for the bodily health that he had received, he repaid the gift by service. Now, my favorite story of this type concerns a certain Alice of Essex, whose arm was healed, or her arm was paralyzed after she saw an apparition. This Alice traveled to many shrines until she was finally healed at Reading, where, the collector writes, being grateful for the favors of the apostle, she devoted herself to his service. She washed the towels and other linen dressings of the church, receiving only the necessities for her body. She gave devoted service to God and the apostle for quite a time, until she was seduced and abducted by a certain smith and became his wife, putting an end without leave to the praiseworthy intentions of her conscience. Now, Alice's marriage was clearly viewed as a breach of more than a laundering contract, and such people may well have been seen as much as servants of the saint as of the monastery. At Ely, after a very ill man named Leofmar was cured, he dedicated himself, in the writer's words, with a pure heart, as a servant of the Blessed Virgin Aethelthryth, recounting to all who wished to hear the things which had befallen him. And this finally gets me to the tales part of my title. This word picture of Leofmar telling his story at Ely to all who wished to hear is matched by panels in the miracle windows showing laymen speaking at Becket's tomb. Now we've seen one of these already, with the servant speaking to Etheldred, a companion. And here's another one. This is the concluding panel of the story of the healing of William of Dane, a crippled man whom you see here. And on the right side of the panel, there's yet another lay attendant. And notably, in this scene, there's no monk at all, which is not uncommon, actually. There are quite a few panels with no monks at all, just attendants. So we just see this man, and he's declaring something. Now, declaring what? I would guess that the Glaziers intended us to read him as saying something like, "Behold the great power of the martyr," or something along those lines. But let's also think about what this panel implies more broadly about the speaking power of the non-transient lay population at the shrines. The servants employed by the sacrists, the men and women supported by alms, the hangers-on who refuse to go home, those in the kitchens and guest houses and laundries acclaimed as having been healed by the saint. These lay folk surely did not go about their chores or attend the shrines in silence. Part of the reason people like Elward of Westoning or Alice of Essex were given support or employment in the monastery must have been to keep them around to tell their stories. Even if such people did not have their own stories of miracles to tell, their long-term presence at shrines must have made them repositories of many tales of others, stories and experiences that they could pass along then again for years as they continued to work. As the middlemen at the shrines, and quite literally, as in this image that we started with, it seems highly likely that these lay folk had more to say to pilgrims and listened to them in turn more carefully than the monks did. The 15th century customary from Canterbury I mentioned earlier decrees that the lay clerks deputed to Becket Shrine were always, quote, "to use all meekness, affability, and care when they respond to, speak with, and call together pilgrims." Now, this decree is obviously intended to check rudeness, and I found some stories in miracle collections about insolent lay custodians who refuse pilgrims access to relics. But it is also very suggestive of the amount of oral contact such custodians were expected to have with pilgrims. I am convinced that these lay attendants must have largely defined the oral culture of shrines, especially in moments like these. We will never know now what soothing words and encouraging stories such a man might have murmured while washing someone's leg or feet, but I'll conclude with a story from the Miracles of John of Beverly that gives us a sense of the staying power of such servants' tales. The story is one that the miracle collector remembered from his youth. A man in the household of the Archbishop of York, deaf and dumb since birth, was cured at Beverly, and he, quote, never afterwards wanted to go back home, but remained not far from the monastery next to the lake, where he spent his time supporting himself in the trade of a baker. As a schoolboy, I, says the collector, saw this elderly man with a wife and children. I knew him very well, and often heard him speaking distinctly and fluently. With the young boys sitting or standing about, he used to tell how the Lord, through St. John, gave hearing and speech to him who had been deaf and dumb since birth. This monk must have remembered this story 20 years or more, since the eloquent baker was long dead by the time this collection was written.